Well, sex in the brain. Like they say on Facebook, it's complicated. We want it to be simple. And we notice behaviors every day of males and females, and we say, oh, that's just like a man, that's just like a woman. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And one example of this that comes to my mind is a wonderful commercial for IBM, where a man and a woman are walking along a beach. He's handsome and she's beautiful, and the weather is gorgeous, there's a beautiful moon, the water is glistening, and she says to him, amore, what are you thinking? And he looks like Bambi in the headlights. So she gives him another chance. She says, amore, what are you thinking? And then he decides to go for it. He says, you know what? I'm thinking that if IBM can wire the Olympic Village and transmit all that information from the huts and the athletic fields over around the world, just think what we could do for our business. And then she looks at him and she goes, amore, what are you really thinking? So this is a kind of prototypical experience, but what about all those women who want to wire the Olympic Village? And what about my husband, my incredibly romantic husband, who's always saying to me, amore, what are you thinking? So we know that there's diversity in this behavior, and we know it's complicated, and so we turn to the brain. We turn to biology to explain it to us. And when we look at the biology, you know what, it's complicated too. The simplest story that we have is a story of sexual development. And in the story of sexual differentiation, we have two pathways. We have an XX pathway for females, and we have an XY pathway for males. And the XX pathway comes from the same primordial or indifferent gonad as the XY pathway, but the XY pathway, there's a special gene on the short arm of the Y chromosome called the SRY gene. And when it gets switched on, the testes start to develop. Testosterone starts to be secreted from the testes, even in utero. And we start to see the development of the male phenotype, of the male body, and not just the genitals, but the brain as well. And our story for the female is that this SRY factor is missing. And so in the female, we don't get the development of the testes, we get the development of the ovaries instead. And when the ovaries develop, they don't secrete estrogens until puberty. So the female brain and the rest of the body develops pretty much in the absence of estrogen, while the male body develops in the presence of testosterone. Now, how does it get complicated? That looks about as simple as you could get. They're just these two pathways. Well, it turns out some males don't actually make a receptor for androgen, so they end up looking like females. Some females have other illnesses like congenital, they call it congenital adrenal hyperplasia, in which they secrete a lot of testosterone during development, so they're born looking a lot like males. And there's actually a lot of crossover on these pathways. And in fact, we know there's this crossover because Sick Kids has a whole clinic for kids like this. And we have surgeries that have been developed in order to create a sexual differentiation after birth for these kids. So that the differentiation and biological pathway is a complicated one, and much more complicated than we like to believe. In addition, the brain is plastic. So even as we go through life, the brain is changing. I hope your brains are changing right now and that you go out of here with a different brain than the brain you've come in with. For example, there's a study of violinists. And when you look at a part of the brain called the somatosensory cortex, in which there's a map of the body surface there, people have seen when they compare the hand region of violinists to the hand region of people who don't play the violin, they find that there's a much larger representation, more neurons devoted to the fingers of the left hand of violinists than there is to the fingers of the left hand of non-violinists. And another study looking at taxicab drivers in London who have to learn all the maps, the streets, incredibly complicated layout of the London street system. These taxicab drivers study for years to be able to pass their exams. Sometimes they have to take this exam 6 or 7 times before they pass. And when you look at the part of the brain that we think plays a role in spatial memory, the hippocampus, it turns out their hippocampi are bigger than the brains of bus drivers, for example, who have to traverse exactly the same streets but don't have to pass this exam and have this knowledge. And the important part about this study is that it turns out it's not that they did well because they have a bigger hippocampus, but they had a smaller hippocampus before they started studying. And over the time that they studied, their hippocampus got bigger. So that's plasticity of the brain par excellence. And in addition to this plasticity, throughout life, we experience things differently. There's the social world that actually writes on our body and changes our biology. So, for example, there's a fish called the protagonist fish. And the protagonist fish has basically a social structure that has one male and many females. And it turns out if you take the male out of the tank, the largest female will morph into being a male. She'll have the phenotype of a male. And not only that, she, or now he, will fertilize the eggs of females. So the reproductive system actually changes so that it can be male. So these are examples of plasticity throughout the lifetime that is incredibly important. And the social influences that. And so for us as a culture, if we believe that sex is binary, and we push the binary by things as simple as the clothes we wear, or deciding what profession we're going to have, or whether or not we could have a profession, or even our sexual identity, these things end up influencing our biology. So it's complicated, and it's diverse, it's plastic, and it's social. So now the question is, with all of those things being the case, is the literature any good on sex differences in the brain? Are there really sex differences? And what I would say to you is, yes, the literature is as good as any scientific literature. There's some good experiments, and there's some not so good experiments. For example, some experiments that I think, an area of study that I think is really nice is the area of study on the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum in humans is a big fiber bundle that goes from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. And people have thought that the bigger your corpus callosum, the better connected your brain. And so they've been studying this in males and females for about 100 years now. And what they find is that the corpus callosum of females sometimes is larger than that of males. Sometimes the corpus callosum of males is larger than that of females. Sometimes there's no difference at all. And so this is an example, and I correct myself if I was wrong, and if I misstated it at first. This is an example of a study that I think could be left by the wayside, because over 100 years we've really had no answer to it. Another study that could be left by the wayside are the studies of gay behaviors in rodents. So in trying to show that there's a biological basis to gay behavior, which there may or may not be, we've developed rodent models. And I guess what I would say is, do you think it's possible for a rat to be gay? I'm not so sure about that. And so that actually opens up questions to me about that whole literature. Now, some literature that I think is very good and that you could make book on is the literature showing that females have a different set of connections in the brain that mediate the ovulatory cycle or the menstrual cycle. There's a part of the brain called the ventral medial nucleus, and in the ventral medial nucleus, it's been shown that there are interconnections between neurons that are different in males and females. And if you lesion those connections in the females, they will no longer have an ovulatory cycle. If you actually give the males estrogen, if you deprive the males of testosterone before birth, they will develop that circuit. And if you give the females testosterone before birth, they will not make that circuit. And I think that's a very powerful series of experiments and areas to study. So there's some really nice science, and there's some difficult science. Another very nice scientific study, I think, is the area looking at language differences between humans, human males and females. And I think it's been pretty conclusively shown that females and males have different organization of language areas. And females tend to have language represented in both hemispheres of the brain, and also probably more anteriorly, more in the front of the brain than males do. And this has really functional repercussions in the sense that when males have a stroke, they have a much more difficult time regaining language function than females do, because females have some other areas that they can call on that allow them to develop language function. So again, the biology shows us that what's important here is not so much that it's true or not true that there's sex differences, but that there's diversity, and there's plasticity, and there's the social. So I said to myself, instead of critiquing all the literature, what I would like to do is I'd like to do some science, some neuroscience, that actually takes that into account, this diversity into account. And what I decided to do was to take an example of a sex difference that I thought you could make book on. And I think you would probably agree with me that it's pretty safe to say that XY organisms do not have ovaries and XX organisms do have ovaries. And the net effect of having ovaries for females is that we actually make a lot of estrogen and a lot of progesterone, and that actually affects our neurons. Our neurons have estrogen and progesterone receptors. And so what I was interested in finding out was how does what the ovaries secrete affect women's moods? And how does what the ovaries secrete affect women's brain health? So the first experiment that I did with a bunch of colleagues was to study a group of women who were in their reproductive age, and I asked myself, and our colleagues asked ourselves, is there such a thing as women's moods actually depending on their hormones? And we kind of believe that as a society, that women have something called premenstrual syndrome. I'm PMSing today. And the results of our experiments show you how important this idea is to society, because we got a firestorm of publicity over our findings. So when we studied women in the community who were not help-seeking, who didn't know that the study was about the menstrual cycle, and we asked them every day for 42 days what their mood was like, and we looked at positive mood and negative mood. And we also got them to urinate in a cup, and we measured their estrogen and progesterone every single day. We found that actually there's no correlation between estrogen, progesterone, and negative mood or positive mood. What made a difference to these women was, to their mood, was whether they felt that they had social support and whether they felt that they were in good health or not. That's what correlated with mood. So I found this remarkable. Now, that's not to say that there weren't one or two women in this study whose negative mood correlated with the phase of their menstrual cycle. But the majority of women, they didn't know that. They didn't show that. Does this mean that the ovaries aren't important to women outside of reproduction? No, that's not what it means. And the next experiment that we've been doing, and other people have shown this, is that if you remove the ovaries and from women before natural menopause, and that is you remove their major source of estrogen and progesterone, those women have a higher rate of all causes of death toward the end of life. They have a higher rate of dementia, higher rate of Parkinson's disease, and if you look at them 6 months after they've had their ovaries removed, their verbal memory has decreased, and they're beginning to show the kinds of decrement in cognition that eventually could lead to dementia. So the ovaries and estrogens are incredibly important for women's brain health, but they may not be that important for women's moods. So again, I'd like to emphasize that when you look in context, taking into account that the brain is plastic and can change over life, and that society actually shapes a lot of our behavior, like the fact that we believe that there's PMS. I had a radio announcer say to me, Dr. Einstein, I don't know what I'm going to tell my wife. She's going to be so upset when she finds out she can't have PMS. And I said to him, this is what you do. You say, darling, your feelings are so important to me that I want to know about them every day of the month. So he was pretty perplexed by that, but I think he went away happy. So in conclusion, what I want to say is we need to do science that takes diversity, plasticity, and experience and the social into account. We need to study the brains of females and males and everybody in between, and we need to acknowledge the wide diversity of that territory. Thank you very much.